Hello, welcome to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl Christensen. I'm joined tonight by Matt, Cameron, and Johnny's back, and he's making fun of me, which isn't helpful to the podcast, Johnny. My job right now is to make fun of Tim, who's not even here, so you can't turn the tables on me. Welcome back, Johnny. It's been a couple of episodes since you've been here, so yeah.
Thank you very much. I think the number of listeners goes down every time I'm on, but that's okay. I'm having fun.
Yeah, but we appreciate your presence on the podcast usually. No, we're happy to have everyone back, and tonight we're going to be talking about World War II. Now, if you followed our podcast for any length of time or gone back and listened to some of our library, you've seen that we've done a history. Well, it was part of a mini series that we were going to continue, and we probably still will in the future. This is kind of an excerpt podcast. So instead of doing it by the decades, we decided to do a World War II focused podcast. So this is the basics of World War II. Now, we understand that the layman out there has some basic information about World War II. It turns out that is pretty much in any history class you've ever taken, at least in the United States. I'm guessing globally, World War II is taught, some of the basic facts there. And then pretty much any novel that you've ever read is probably at least tangentially about World War II. I'm currently reading 2 books, and they are both about World War II. So it is
100% rate for backing up your assertion there. So based on those 2 data points, yes, all books are about World War II.
So I do all my statistics. Go back and listen to our statistics podcast. Anecdote.
The Iliad might say otherwise.
So there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of good information out there. But what happens a lot is when there's so much information, it's hard to get the bare bones and a little bit of the structure of what actually happened during World War II. Outside of just maybe your history class, which is probably for a lot of us well in the past, and or maybe we fell asleep. So we'd like a little bit of a refresher course, and that's very good at history. And I believe each of us, Cameron and I and Johnny, have all had some good exposure to World War II history. And so we're going to go through and talk a little bit about the events and what transpired during that World War, which was, as all wars are, a tragedy, but one that shaped the world that we live in. So, Matt, before you tell us a little bit about the events and the dates or whatever else, tell us a little bit about what the lie of the land was, I guess, in Germany, and why we were what things looked like right before the war.
Well, they looked bad. Usually wars do not start when things are going well.
Quite.
And keep in mind, our faithful listeners out there will remember that World War II was a continuation of a number of activities that started back in the 30s. Japan and China, or the lands that are now China, had been going for some time with different military conflicts of smaller or larger scale. In Germany, especially, things were not so great in the 1920s and 30s. World War I had left Germany pretty badly crippled. And so Germans were looking for anything that could get them some level of prosperity, national pride, basically take them from being the defeated group to something a little bit more. And so Hitler comes along, and he is very nationalist. He's talking about how awesome Germany is, and he's proposing all these radical reforms and all these different ideas, all to kind of save the day for Germany, to bring it back from the depths of defeat, to make Germany into a world power and restore its prestige and so forth. Okay, so, being proud of your country is great. The danger is when you start doing that at the detriment or to the blame of another group. And that was kind of what Hitler did. He basically said, all of Germany's problems are these other people's fault. The communists, different political parties that I don't like, and most famously, the Jews. And so if you can start pointing people at another group and tell them that this is why you have all the problems you have, not only will they get behind you, this is a terrible part of human nature, by the way. Please do not fall for this, dear listener. But not only will they get behind you, but they will start to hate other people, because that's easy to do. It's nice when I can blame someone else for my woes. And so you had the surge in nationalist feeling, this surge in attempt to bring back Germany's glories and prestige and bring it out of the depths of poverty and despair into which it had been cast following World War I. And it really was pretty bad following World War I. So that's kind of the lay of the land. In 1938, Hitler, and with the agreement of some people, certainly not all people, but with his cronies in Austria, executes what is known as the Anschluss, which I probably pronounced wrong, but basically annexes chunks of Austria and other bits of Europe. And the world views this with concern, but come on, we just got out of World War I not too long ago. We don't really want to push anything. Spain is just coming through its horrifically bloody civil war. Yeah, we're just gonna let this go. I
had
guess.
a question.
Yeah.
About along those lines. So you like you said, like the Hitler's rise to power was quick, but it wasn't overnight. I mean, there was a bit of a time period in which people were seeing this situation. The Nazi Party, which was the National Socialist Party, which was very, radical, gained power in Germany, and with Hitler at the head of that movement, and so then the Olympics happened, and people had the exposure to some of the issues but before that, the world was a bit aware of the issues. But how did Europe, who had just finished war, like you said, and there were other issues going on, but I guess how were people so unprepared? And by people I mean other governments, so unprepared for this onslaught that was about to take place, given the recent history of issues and just what they'd already seen of Hitler.
Yeah, well, we'll get into maybe some of the military preparations or lack thereof, and how and why Hitler was able to do things. And you're right, Hitler's rise to power was not particularly smooth. His book, for which he is most famous, Mein Kampf, which is My Struggle or My War, was actually written in prison, I think, because the German authorities in power at the time did not like this young upstart who was being radical and fomenting discord and prancing about in silly looking shorts. So yeah, when I think Hitler became chancellor in, was it 1933, 1935, 1933, he became chancellor of Germany, and he set about getting his team, his country, ready for his plans, his plans of 1,000-year Reich, basically a Germany that would dominate Europe for the next millennium. And in complete defiance of all of the Allied resolutions that were passed at the end of World War I, he started to rearm secretly. And then a little bit more openly. And he had arrangements with Russia, which is a little weird because the fascists in Germany and the communists in Russia were about as ideologically opposed as you can possibly get. Nonetheless, they had arrangements whereby German military personnel would go over to Russia, where they would fly German airplanes and practice combat maneuvers and well, practice for combat over in Russia. And it was fine because no one else could see it, and the Russians were complicit, and that was great. We also had the Spanish Civil War, where the Luftwaffe in particular got to they got a jump start on.
And also for the Luftwaffe, for the Layman, that's the German Air Force.
That is the German Air Force, translates to air weapon. Luft meaning air, Waffe meaning waffle, or possibly weapon.
The air waffles.
Yes, but and keep in mind, the period in the early 1900s of World War I and World War II were periods of revolutionary change to the way that warfare is fought and waged. And you had things that the world had never seen before that started to make huge tactical and strategic differences, particularly air power, which was not a thing before World War I. And so Germany gets a head start with air power when they go over and fight in the Spanish Civil War, and they kind of run wild. They do really well, weirdly, fighting against Russians on the Spanish nationalist side. But they really kind of get a head start in some of these revolutionary new combat things, and they start to learn about joint campaigns integrating air and land power, close air support, all of these ideas that modern militaries take for granted, because most modern militaries learned them the hard way during World War II. The Germans learned them a little bit in advance, and so they went into that with some advantage there. That's just part of it. But with that, there's much more going on. You had Hitler starting to mobilize and rearm and build up a military. In the late 1930s, he and not he, but Germany, his representative and the Soviet representative sign a mutual non-aggression pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where basically, I don't know. I wish I could say I don't know why you would sign this, but recent history has shown that you will sign anything, I guess. Basically, both countries promised not to attack each other for a decade. 10 years, we're just not going to shoot. After that, all bets are off. But for the next 10 years, Soviet Union, we absolutely pinky swear that Nazi Germany shall verily not attack you. This is like 1938. And we will see how well that went when we get to 1940. But that's kind of the lay of the land. You have Hitler mobilizing to concern without anyone really moving. You have a not novice military now. They've been blooded and earned veteran status in the Spanish Civil War. And you still have much of Europe recovering from the effects of World War I. And so that's kind of where you are. And maybe I wasn't alive back then, obviously, fortunately. I wonder if maybe you had some complacency on the part of the Allies, as opposed to how driven the Germans were to restore their country's prestige, because they'd just been absolutely thwomped following World War I. The reparations that were exacted of Germany were really, really hard for them to bear. Not saying whether that was right or wrong. It's just it made life difficult for your average German. So anyway, does that give you kind of the prelude to World War I?
One of the things, though, that you already brought up, and I wanted to ask about also as we get into some of the dates and more of the, further past the Anschluss, was you mentioned that, and everyone knows, the layman knows that Hitler and the Nazis hated Jews. Specifically, why? You mentioned they hate the communists and they hate the Jews. Everyone knows that they, what all the atrocities that were committed on the Jewish people. Any particular reason that you know of?
There's the internet legend that it was because he was kicked out of art school. I don't put too much stock into that. I confess I have not made a study of the writings of Adolf Hitler, so I don't really know that much about the origins of his ideology, and I'm okay with that. But I don't have a great answer on why specifically he chose that group to target. But
Okay.
other than perhaps, again, keep in mind the situation in much of Germany is pretty destitute. And Jews had a stereotype of, well, kind of being wealthy, being the guys behind the financial institutions. They had the money. So if they have the money and you don't have the money, I wonder if that's maybe why he made them a target. I don't know. I guess I'm speculating.
Just based on my sorry, Tim, were you going to say something? Tim has joined us also.
Yeah. Sorry. If I could insert, I think that, and again, speaking as a layman here, but I think that your scholars who study the history of the Jewish people would suggest that the Holocaust, they would frame it not as an individual event, but rather a continuation of centuries of persecution and opportunistic, attacks against the Jews. Hitler was from the first civic leader to turn on the Jews as a convenient scapegoat. And again, I don't, like Matt says, I also don't know what his origins were, but antagonism towards the Jews, and when things go south, we look around and who's to blame, who caused this. The Holocaust was not the first time that the Jews were the victims in violence of that kind of mindset.
Yeah, that's a good point. Hitler didn't invent anti-Jewish sentiment. He exploited it. He played on it. And you're right. It is something that is not new, unfortunately. So.
Okay.
I think we should also
Go ahead,
mention that it wasn't only the Jews, that it was the undesirable people that he attacked. It was also people that were mentally disabled, vagrants, blacks. There was quite a few people that kind of went under that.
Basically, any minority. The gypsies were severely victimized as well. But anyway, this is. We could spend an entire podcast on the evils of Hitler. We could spend. The man was evil incarnate, but a lot of it came back to that idea that if I can point my people towards an enemy, someone that they can blame, someone that they can hate, or in his case, multiple someones that they can blame and hate, then I can get these dudes to follow me. And so that's what he did.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure we'll talk more a little bit later about obviously some of the just atrocities, the concentration camps, but let's move on to some of the beginning of the war, some of the fights. You said talk about the Anschluss, but then there's more military conflict shortly thereafter.
So World War II kind of, I guess the recognized event comes on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland, and they charge in there. Parts of Poland hold out for towards the end of the month, but Poland is pretty badly outmatched here, and defenses are mounted. Warsaw is quickly encircled, and to add to Poland's troubles, about mid-month, the Soviets invade too, because again, they had the non-aggression pact with Germany, and they kind of planned a lot of this. Who was going to be under whose sphere of influence? They were going to carve this up into a Soviet sphere and a German sphere, and that was going to be the thing. And so Poland gets taken down by the Germans, and meanwhile, most of Europe reacts by immediately declaring themselves neutral, with the exceptions of England or of Great Britain and France, who deliver some ultimatums to Germany that go unanswered, and then 1 to 2 days later, they declare themselves in a state of war with Germany. If you've seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or read that book, you know that the children were moved out to the countryside to protect them. Well, that movement actually started the same day that Hitler invaded Poland, where about 1 million citizens were evacuated from British cities. Sorry, go ahead.
There's another book that I recently read to my kids, was The War That Saved My Life, and that also documents the kind of the beginning of the war in Britain and how the children were shipped off, and
so Poland is pretty quickly conquered. Shortly after that, you have Germany begins to move against these other neighboring countries as well. Poland happened in September. Immediately after that, you have what came to be known as the Phony War, where Britain and France started putting together forces on the continent in France. And France even launched a limited offensive into Germany. It didn't get very far, but they just started putting forces on the ground, getting ready for wider scale operations. This lasts until May of 1940. It's called the Phony War. In the interim, in April and May of 1940, Germany invades Denmark and Norway, and they both surrender. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union is making overtures toward Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, saying things like, wouldn't it be great if we had large Soviet military bases inside your countries, in case something bad were to happen? I mean, you can,
like the mafia?
Yeah, you can literally imagine it as a cartoon mafia villain, because that's like, I mean, all the subtlety of a sledgehammer here.
And is Stalin in charge at the beginning?
Stalin is in charge, and at one point he tells the Finns that, look, if you guys don't agree to this quick, there might be an accident that happens. And sure enough, not too much after that, in November of 1939, an accident happens where some Russian soldiers are bombarded by artillery from Finland. The artillery shells happen to be Russian, coming from Russian guns manned by other Russians. But it's a false flag operation that kicks off what is known as the Winter War, where the Russians, the Soviets, go into Finland and attempt to annex some chunks of strategically valuable land. This ends up going horrifically badly for the Russians at a tactical level, where you have these peasant conscripts. These are just half-starved kids who have been given a rifle that might not work, that are going up against a very determined enemy in the Finns. And so some of our layman viewers may be familiar with Chris Kyle, American sniper who served with distinction in Iraq. But the highest killing sniper of all time was a Finnish guy named Simo Häyhä. I probably pronounced that wrong. But in 100 days against the Russians, he had over 500 confirmed kills. He was taking out 5 Russians a day by himself. He stalked and annihilated entire platoons. And this was, that was the most extreme example, but this was not an isolated tactical incident. The Winter War was horrifically bloody for the Soviets. That said, they could afford it. They had hordes of conscript peasants, and the Finns did not. And so the Winter War ended with a peace accord in Russia's favor, where Finland did end up ceding some land to them. This put Finland in a really bad position because you have Germany, who is not well regarded by the rest of the world right now because they've just invaded Poland. And you have the Soviet Union knocking at your doorstep, these two large powers now. And the Allies aren't particularly close to you, and Britain and France don't have any alliance agreements with you. You really have the Germans to your south, and you have the Soviets to your east. And so what do you do? And it kind of becomes an enemy of my enemy is less of my enemy kind of thing. And so Finland is put in a position where they're not necessarily on Germany's side, but they're willing to accept German assistance. And this kind of goes on throughout World War II for poor Finland. Meanwhile, continuing on back in the south, in Western Europe, in May of 1940, on the 10th, Germany launches their offensive into France, and France had built up these defenses called the Maginot Line, expecting a German invasion through Belgium, I believe, through a certain attack corridor, because of course that's how you would do it. Well, Germany didn't do that. They went through the Ardennes forest, which is not a fun forest to move armored groups and soldiers through, but they did it anyway. And they bypassed the Maginot Line, and this is where kind of the concept of Blitzkrieg was born. And they sweep into France. And
I thought Blitzkrieg was born with the Polish attack.
Well, I mean, kind of, sort of. I mean, there was no. My understanding is there was never a point where the Germans said, "Hey, this time we're doing Blitzkrieg."
Right. This is
it's a term that's been
analysis.
retroactively applied to all of these initial campaigns.
Right.
So, and Blitzkrieg from the German Blitz, lightning, Krieg, war. Blitzen is lightning, whatever. Anyway, lightning war, fast war. And here I've kind of mentioned the Germans with their experience with combined arms, where they have air and land forces working in concert with each other. Really, and in particular, they have infantry and armor working together with the German tanks, the Panzers, working very closely and integrated with the infantry units. And suddenly these become very, very hard to stand up against. You can't really deploy your anti-armor teams to take out the tanks because you have German infantry firing away at them. And you can't counterattack with a large infantry formation because the German armor is pinning them down. And if you don't have a mixed and integrated armor and infantry force yourself, preferably with some air cover, this becomes very hard to stand against, and it was hard to stand against. And so France falls, and unfortunately now the Brits are in a position where they've already moved 1 million plus men onto the continent, and they're stuck. And
is this where we get to Dunkirk?
We do get to Dunkirk. At the end of May, you have all of these British troops on the beaches, completely surrounded by German forces and subjected to German air attack. And the British basically go out to their population and say, if you have a boat, we need you. And they pull off a modern miracle, and they manage to evacuate a massive army from the beaches at Dunkirk back to Britain to fight another day. And they save the British army. And without that miracle, British military power would have been utterly crippled. And that's kind of what's going on up in mainland Europe. Shortly after that, Italy decides that it's going to be on Germany's side, so it enters the war on June 11th.
Their leader was Mussolini. Right?
Mussolini, yep. And that happens right before France formally surrenders on June 22nd. And the surrender arrangement is that Germany is going to occupy most of France, and then southern France will have its own independent provisional government that will be friendly to Germany, but not under direct German control, and it's based in Vichy, and so you have the Vichy French government that kind of runs southern France for a bit, not under the direct control of Germany, but definitely under the control of Germany.
So are these this Vichy government?
Yeah.
Was it also? Was it? So Mussolini was a social. What was he? Anyway, it was. Were these all kind of nationalist type?
I'm not really sure what the Vichy movement was, but it was essentially a puppet government set up by the Germans to administer the affairs of southern France while they administered the affairs of northern France. Okay. Later on, Italy, Germany, and Japan in the fall of 1940 sign a pact, the tripartite, I probably said that wrong, pact, where they basically all say, look, we're all on the same side. We're not going to fight each other. Yay. Jumping back into the summer, Britain has managed to survive to fight another day, but Germany doesn't want that day to come. They want that day to happen sooner rather than later. They want to launch an invasion of Britain, and they have plans for Operation Sea Lion, where they're going to charge across the English Channel and deploy the Wehrmacht, the German army, and take over Britain. And they recognize, because they're seeing the experience as that, the significant way that air power can influence a battle. They're seeing that first they've got to eliminate the Royal Air Force, and also they need to kind of soften up Britain. And so they start bombing it. They bomb London. They launch all of these raids, and going up against these bombing raids and these attacks is the RAF, the Royal Air Force, with a comparatively limited number of fighters and pilots. But from July to October, you have the Battle of Britain, and this is in the history of aerial conflict. This fight is legendary in the way that Britain managed to hold off the Luftwaffe and their superior numbers. And there's a number of reasons why the British were able to be so successful. The British had an integrated command and control chain where they had radar stations and ground control intercept officers that with a remarkably polished communication chain, that it would be minutes from when a contact was picked up on radar to when a fighter was scrambled under the direction of a single controller on a certain vector saying, go here, wait to intercept, you're going to see something. And that was it. And it was a very slickly oiled machine. It didn't help the Germans that they were fighting over England at kind of the maximum range of their aircraft. When a German fighter got over England, they had enough fuel for about 6 minutes of combat, which is not a whole. Yeah, that's not. You got to be quick, because if you aren't, the next wave of RAF fighters is going to tear you apart. So Britain definitely had a home field advantage, a fuel advantage, and their command and control system was a very well-oiled machine.
So were there no aircraft carriers in the up there by the coast of Britain?
German ones?
German ones.
Yeah, the Germans never fielded an aircraft carrier. They had plans for one, but the other thing is that the British, again, naval air power was only starting to be understood. The very first glimmers of understanding of what naval air power could mean, and the British enjoyed naval supremacy. The British home fleet was pretty dominant, and a German aircraft carrier to get close enough to launch effective sorties would have been within range of British land-based bombers, of the British Home Fleet, it would have had a bad time. And so I don't know that would have been much of an option. There were British aircraft carriers, and they would sail down to the Mediterranean and other places and wreak havoc with their carrier-based fighters, and they provided some convoy escort as well.
Yeah. So I was
Sorry,
going to say,
go
because I know that Germany had U-boats,
Yep.
submarines, but
So-
so you're saying they didn't have much in the way of battleships or then no aircraft carriers.
No, they definitely had battleships, and let's back up to 1939. And I apologize. World War II is large, so I'm going to miss important things. But shortly after Germany invades Poland and Britain declares war, Germany starts. They kick off what becomes known as the Battle of the Atlantic. And the first thing that they torpedo is a British passenger liner headed off to Canada. And 200 plus people are killed. And the commander of the German U-boat force, Karl Donitz, says, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to attack passenger ships. We are only going to attack British merchant ships and warships, period. Well, that lasts for about a month. And then things are relaxed, and it becomes, we're going to attack French things too. And it becomes, we're going to attack anything. And the Battle of the Atlantic rages through much of World War II in one form or another. Germany fields just hordes of submarines, hundreds of them. And their whole purpose is to go out there and cut off supply lines from North America in particular, and the other outlying British possessions. You have supplies coming from India, you have them coming from Africa, you have them coming from all over the place. And in the way, you have U-boat forces in the Northern Atlantic, Southern Atlantic, off the coast of the Americas, off the coast of Africa, all of them hunting for merchant convoys. At the same time, Germany actually does have some very formidable battleships. In particular, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz are incredible weapons, and the idea that a German battleship could get out could break free into the Atlantic and devastate some of these convoys is at first borne out when there's a ship, the Graf Spee, which goes off and does some commerce raiding and takes down a couple merchant vessels in the Southern Atlantic, and is eventually cornered in, I think, Uruguay by a force of 3 British cruisers and ends up being scuttled. But the fact that this large German gunship was floating around blasting away at these merchant vessels who could do nothing against it is terrifying. And so you have the implementation of a convoy system where large groups of merchant vessels traveling and carrying war supplies will be escorted by a small force of destroyers or a carrier with covering aircraft, and run back and forth across the Atlantic to and from Britain and Russia. And this is a whole big thing throughout the war, the submarines picking off parts of these convoys and the escorting ships, trying to knock them down, all the while the British are trying to prevent a German surface battleship like the Bismarck or the Tirpitz from breaking out. And because if a destroyer escorting a convoy comes up against a German capital battleship, it's not going to go well for the destroyer, and that convoy will just be annihilated. And so the British can devote considerable effort to finding these large German ships and trying to neutralize them. And this goes on for some time through 1943. But anyway, that's kind of the Battle of the Atlantic, and I've jumped a little bit ahead in the timeline. But does that answer that question? The German naval focus was really on submarines and then on a couple large capital ships that really had their effect as a fleet in being. The fact that they existed tied down a number of British and Allied naval forces that were not free to go off and do other things like, attack German ports in the Mediterranean or Africa, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, that does make sense. I guess I had just thought that, and I know that not all of our, but most of the co-hosts on this podcast here, mutual grandfather was on an aircraft carrier, and I know that the United States had a number of aircraft carriers. So I figured that Germany would have had to have invested in those as well. Newer technology, but not unknown, obviously. It surprises me that they didn't have any.
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a different tactical situation. Germany was really trying to project power around Europe, where the United States was trying to project power across oceans. But yeah, it is a bit different. We'll get to U.S. aircraft carriers when they talk about the Pacific if we have time to address the Pacific.
We get there.
Yeah.
Well, let's move quickly through the war here then.
Yeah, so 1940, the Battle of Britain ends. By
the way, that's the Churchill quote. Never was so much owed by so many to so few.
Yeah, something never in the course of human events has so much been owed by so many to so few. Speaking of the RAF and everything that they did. It ends in defeat for the Luftwaffe and the cancellation or postponement of Operation Sea Lion. And this is a pretty significant strategic thing. This has massive repercussions throughout the war because of Germany's other plans. They really wanted Sea Lion to happen and to be over and done with so that they could focus on other things, which we will get to in a bit. Towards the end of 1941, of 1940, the Italians have kind of entered the war and invaded British-held Egypt from Italian-held Libya. And so there's a North African campaign started, and the Italians kind of stall. And so the Germans send down one of their best generals, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, with his Africa Corps down to North Africa to kind of straighten things out. And unfortunately for the Allies, Rommel is very, very good. And things go very badly for the Allies in North Africa for quite some time. Finally, in December, I guess we'll get to that later, but you have this North Africa theater kicking off in December of 1941, 1940, where the British achieve a significant victory against the Italians. The Germans look at that and go, okay, time to step in. And so they send Rommel down there shortly after. Going back to Operation Sea Lion, this is aborted. Germany is not going to invade the UK, but they're also not going to derail all of their plans. And so, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact only like 3 years old, Germany invades Russia in June of 1941. Britain is still alive to the west, and they're not happy. And now Germany is charging eastward into Russia. And the initial German advances into Russia go spectacularly well. It is so bad how utterly unprepared the Russians are for this. And, they sweep in, Russian outposts are reporting German hordes are coming across, and they're getting responses from headquarters. What do you mean, Germans? And why aren't your messages coded? The ruling elite of the Communist Party charge into Stalin's office saying, Chairman, what should we do? They find him hiding under his desk because he was pretty sure that they were there to arrest him. Fortunately for him, he's worked up his cult of personality so far that it has not crossed their mind to arrest this idiot. And, he pivots beautifully on the moment and continues dictating and continues losing for some time. And the Germans just sweep into Russia, penetrating to the outskirts of Moscow before they are finally repulsed for a bit. And that's much of the end of 1941 as far as World War II goes. Now, in the meantime, in the Pacific theater and over in Asia, Japan and China are continuing to fight, and Japan is continuing to have pretty significant success against the Chinese. But they have a problem in that the U.S. Navy is a thing. Excuse me. And there are possessions that the United States has in the Pacific. They have footholds, and they have the potential to exert power and thwart Imperial Japanese plans. And so the Japanese, they turn to a brilliant military commander, Isoroku Yamamoto, to plan a death blow, a crippling strike against the U.S. Navy to annihilate it before it can do anything. And the Japanese have recognized the importance of naval aviation and the role that it can play in pivoting a campaign. And so their number one objective is to find and destroy the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, eliminate its ability to project that power that could intervene and threaten their ambitions in the Pacific. And so on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. And their objective is to destroy the U.S. Navy carriers that should be there. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, two questions.
Yeah.
One, so this if the layman's listening along and generally aware that World War II started in 1938 and now it's 1941 and the U.S. is still uninvolved.
Yeah, we're at the end of 1941.
Right.
So World War II in Europe started in September 1939. This is 2 years later. The British Army has escaped Dunkirk. France has fallen. The RAF has defeated the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Hitler has charged into Russia and is having phenomenal success. And the U.S. has declared itself a non-belligerent, but they are still providing material to France at the start before it fell, and to Britain continually through these Atlantic convoys, and to the Soviet Union through different agreements. As soon as Germany attacks the Soviet Union, well, again, the enemy of my enemy is less of my enemy. And so the United States is providing significant amounts of war material, Sherman tanks, fighter planes, medium bombers, to the Soviet Union, because none of us like Germany right now.
Hey, sorry, really quick. Did Germany take over Spain, Portugal? I mean, we've got the whole mainland of Europe.
No, Germany stayed out of Spain, and I'm honestly not sure why. I'd have to do some more research. But keep in mind that Germany came into the Spanish Civil War on the side of the eventual winners, Francisco Franco, who rose to power following the Spanish Civil War. He received help from Germany, and so you already had a friendly team down there, I guess. But no, they didn't get down that far. And then, as you know, Italy came in on the side of Germany as well. There is so much to World War II to cover that I can't get all of it. But I will mention that Italy didn't waste any time invading everyone around them as well. Albania, Greece, they launched these campaigns. Meanwhile, much of Eastern Europe is either declaring itself neutral or slowly shifting over to the Axis side. And it gets a little bit more complicated when the Axis side fractures, when Germany invades the Soviet Union. But you have Yugoslavia being broken up, parts of it being absorbed or having different governments installed. You have Bulgaria jumping in on the side of the Soviets, and then when Germany attacks the Soviets, they kind of they don't necessarily join in on the attack on the Soviet Union, but they're still on the Axis side. Romania is put in a similarly bad situation, and there's coups, there are overthrows. The king of Romania abdicates, and another puppet government is kind of installed there. Anyway, go ahead.
Once again, for the layman, Axis are bad guys. It's very, very simplistic. Allies are good guys. Once again, very simplistic. However, yes. Like you said, some of these people kind of went back and forth. I mean, Russia was on the Axis side until it wasn't.
Right. I mean, Finland was really on. They were really friendly to whoever was not invading them at the moment. And maybe friendly is the wrong word. They were really just trying to survive. So, to put them in either an Axis or Allied side is probably a gross oversimplification.
It's also a good time to mention that we have a number of listeners in Germany, and I do wonder what is taught about World War II in Germany. I think
that's a topic for another time.
Okay, all right, we can continue.
All right. So, going back to Pearl Harbor, December 7th, the Japanese attack, and due to some bureaucratic errors and making the Japanese ambassador wait far longer than he should have, the United States does not actually receive the Japanese formal declaration of war until after the attack has happened, which is not the Japanese intent. Their intent was to drop off the declaration of war in Washington the morning of December 7th and time the airstrike to occur after that had happened. But the Japanese ambassadors kept waiting for hours. And so that doesn't happen. And it's a surprise attack, and it's devastating to the U.S. Navy. They lose a number of battleships and 2,000 sailors killed. And they're caught completely flat-footed, except for the carriers, who had been caught in a freak typhoon in the Pacific and delayed from making it back to the port. And this is another critical strategic factor. As the Japanese are reporting on the success of their air raid, all forces in World War II had a tendency to over-exaggerate the successes of their campaigns, whether it was planes shot down, troops killed, battleships sunk, whatever. So the Japanese believe that they have effectively crushed the U.S. naval force in the Pacific.
Really quick before we move away from the Pearl Harbor attack, I didn't know because, well, I don't know a lot of things, but there are like conspiracy, not like I want to dig into conspiracy theories too much, but
yeah, please don't.
But let's just say some people believe that there was more going on as to why the U.S. was not prepared for the Pearl Harbor attack. But generally, the mainstream belief, essentially, I guess, is that we just weren't expecting Japan to hit us, right? Like we just thought we weren't going. Why exactly? I guess were we just so unprepared for a Japanese attack on a military base? You'd imagine that we would have been ready for something like that.
Yeah, well, to those people, one, I will cite you back to our recent podcast on logical razors, and then tell you to stop believing in conspiracies, you idiot. Sorry, but come on. And then second, let's talk about the Doolittle Raid and show you how this type of thing can happen. So Pearl Harbor goes down. American sentiment immediately becomes inflamed against Japan. Grandfather explained it. We went into Europe because the Germans were bad. This was the right thing to do. We were going to help our ally. Germany, by the way, declares war on the United States the day after the Pearl Harbor attack. But we went against the Japanese because they were our enemy, the United States enemy. They attacked us, and there was rabid hatred towards the Japanese on the American side because they attacked us.
Which led to the
and I mean
camps.
recent among other things, but recent history has shown that if you attack the United States gets pretty angry, and so we kick off campaigns in Afghanistan and other places, and you bring a lot of wrath with you. That wrath was not easily focused because the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor had been very effective, and the Japanese then went on to have very effective campaigns throughout the Pacific, conquering Wake Island in particular. Was the U.S. The Japanese attacked it, took everyone prisoner. To be a prisoner of war to the Japanese in World War II was grim. Thousands.
A book.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to point them at. Maybe you've seen the movie Unbroken. Is it
Unbroken. Louis Zamperini. Yep.
Yeah. Zamperini. Yeah, exactly.
He goes. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's. I can recommend the movie, but what's better is the book, and the book is narrative history. It's not fiction, but it is follows him on a kind of a narrative, a very story type approach. So it's very approachable for those that generally have a hard time getting into historical reading, and so it's really good, a very good read, and it does tell you a little bit about the Japanese POWs and how nightmarish that situation was.
Yeah,
I can vouch for it too, because it's hard for me to get into history, books, and but it was a really good read. It was really interesting, and so yeah, it's definitely a good book to read.
Well, with that plug, yeah.
Are they paying us?
They will be soon.
Anyway. So yeah, the reports of some of these atrocities get back to the United States and continue to inflame American sentiment against the Japanese. In particular, the story of the Bataan Death March, which the Japanese went into the Philippines and took the Philippines. They captured between 60 and 80,000 prisoners of war, both American and Filipino, and basically marched them until they died. And it was pretty grim. Sometimes people just being killed outright, buried alive. We could spend more podcasts on atrocities committed on both sides, on all sides throughout World War II. But anyway, the Japanese are doing well in the Pacific as far as winning things goes. Two things come into play, though. The first is the Battle of the Coral Sea, which takes place in the Pacific in early 1942. And this is the first real battle where naval aviation is dominant. And this takes place between May 4th and May 8th in 1942. In the Coral Sea, in the southern Pacific. The United States has a pair of carriers there, the USS Yorktown, the USS Lexington, with a small force of escorting cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese have a much larger naval fleet with more carriers, battleships, and additional cruisers and destroyers. And they're essentially fought to a stalemate. Both sides lose one carrier. The United States loses the USS Lexington, and but it's the first time that the Japanese don't win, and the first time that their offensives are able to be blunted. Now, at the same time, I'm sorry, not quite at the same time. A month before, you had an event that I alluded to. The United States has to do something to not only, public opinion is enraged at the Japanese, but it's also fearful. The Japanese were able to strike us. They caught us off guard. They caught us flat-footed. And this is before the days of wide ocean surveillance. So yes, you can get a fleet places. And we weren't on a wartime footing, and so they did come in and catch us unprepared. But they're prepared. They're watching the Pacific. They have pickets. They have an unstoppable navy with way more battleships than we have now, because they sank most of ours. And so how are we going to touch them? We can't. We don't have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We don't have long-range bombers that can make it to Japan from the United States. And so we launched the what is now known as the Doolittle Raid, where we took a number of medium bombers that were absolutely not designed to fly off an aircraft carrier, and we flew them off an aircraft carrier. And we sent the USS Hornet, a light carrier, out into the Pacific with a very light escort, put it out as far as it could go. It actually did get spotted, I believe, by a Japanese picket. And they launched 16 planes, and those planes flew to Japan loaded with fuel and not much else, very light bomb payload. And they hit targets in Japan, and then they flew past Japan into China to land, or to crash land, because that's all they could do. And that Doolittle Raid was kind of that spark of public hope that maybe the Japanese aren't untouchable.
This is all documented in the Pearl Harbor movie from like 2002 or
we need
something.
to stop bringing pop culture references into this.
Ben Affleck was there, I'm pretty sure.
No. Anyway,
there were there's accuracy in that movie though, to some degree. So
yeah, this is why we have Learn It from a Layman, so that people can learn rather than. Anyway, So the Doolittle Raid is executed, and it's a spectacular success in terms of bolstering American morale. From a tactical standpoint, it doesn't do a lot of damage. From a strategic standpoint, it's pivotal, because the Japanese no longer believe in their own invincibility, and they pull massive resources back from their kind of outer Pacific forces, the ones that are conquering islands, and assign them to home defense. And this is part of what kind of starts to stall the Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Okay. The second thing that happens, I kind of got sidetracked. I said two things happened, and then I mentioned Coral Sea and forgot the second thing. The second thing that happens is our intelligence apparatus breaks the Japanese code. And suddenly we're able to read Japanese strategic radio traffic. And we're intercepting messages talking about an attack on some place called AF. And so some clever young intel officer gets the idea of, hey, we think it might be Midway Island. Let's see if we can confirm this. And so the U.S. Navy sends out a spurious bit of message traffic from Midway Island back to the fleet saying, hey, our water station broke. We're having water supply problems on Midway. Help. And sure enough, shortly after that, they intercept some Japanese traffic that says the Americans are reporting water trouble at AF. And suddenly it becomes very clear that, yeah, the Japanese are in fact coming from Midway Island on another surprise attack.
This seems like a good place. So I think there's still a fair amount of World War II we need to cover. This might be a good place to cut.
Yeah, we're at less than half of it.
Right, exactly. It might be a good place, so we're midway through the podcast. Boom. You're welcome. Come on.
I liked it. Very good.
You got nothing from me there.
I didn't think so. Okay. I thought this could be a two-part podcast, given we've got a lot of really good information so far. I don't want to shortchange the end of World War II, and we're not even that close to the end at the moment. So a lot of things still coming down. So in that vein, we're going to wrap up here, and then our next episode, which will be released a week or two after this episode drops, will be World War II Part 2. So that I think will be a good way to handle this. So if you're listening to this and you come grab the second part when it's available. And until then, we'll do some more research into World War II, and we'll be back with you.